Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a new podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we'll talk to experts about a variety of topics and why it matters for U.S. foreign policy. Today I'm talking to Stacie Pettyjohn, Director of the Strategy and Doctrine program at RAND, Project Air Force, and Becca Wasser, who is a fellow in the defense program at the Center for New American Security, about their recent co-authored book, The Air War Against the Islamic State, The Role of Airpower in Operation Inherent Resolve. The episode discussed the findings from their work, including the role of drones in the war against Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, the challenges Russian aircraft pose to U.S. pilots involved in OIR in Syria, and what the lessons learned from this experience means for future aerial combat. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Becca Wasser, a fellow in the defense program and co-lead of the gaming lab at the Center for New American Security, and Stacie Pettyjohn, the Director of Strategy and Doctrine program in Project Air Force at the RAND Corporation, both of whom are two of many authors, I should say, on the recently released RAND monograph book. I call it a book, The Air War Against Islamic State, The Role of Airpower in Operation Inherent Resolve. It's great to have both of you on the show.
Thanks for having us.
You know, I have to say, I kind of knew that you were working on this, but just before we get off the bat here, it really is an incredible book. The depth of coverage and the amount that you both did, or you and your whole entire team did. I will be honest, I have not read the entire thing yet. It is 510 pages, but you know, the stuff that I have read is pretty incredible, and I know how much work that went into it. So congratulations to both of you.
Thanks so much.
It's really due to Becca and our team. Becca led the effort and really provided the leadership and made sure that we got this done. And then we had a great team of people who did all kinds of work through COVID and other trying circumstances to hit our deadline. So, well,
it hats off to both of you. So I wanted to sort of start at the beginning, because air power, at least for these types of operations, have become like sort of the go-to thing. You know, when there was a problem or a crisis, particularly in that part of the world, there was a tendency for analysts and think tankers to always describe, air power and special operations forces as the preferred toolkit to deal with counterterrorism operations. But here we actually got to see a major case study play out over two different countries, Iraq and Syria. So, you know, at the top of your key findings is you discuss the critical role that air power played in the by, with, and through strategy in Operation Inherent Resolve. You know, maybe just walk us through how the air power worked and all of the things that went into being able to deliver a bomb on target both in Syria and Iraq.
Sure. So as reminded this many times by many different airmen correctly, this is not just about putting bombs on target, though that was obviously a big piece of it. For air operations to have the effect, one of the critical things was intelligence and actually having an understanding of what's going on the ground. And that's an area where air power has in the past at times struggled, especially in terms of finding small, elusive, mobile targets, like terrorists driving around in trucks that look like a lot of other trucks that are driving around on the road. So finding the bad guys and actually distinguishing them and making sure that they are the enemy, not innocent civilians, is a difficult thing to do from the sky. And I think in OIR, you see that air power has improved in that regard. Learned a lot since the global war on terrorism, and a lot of capabilities, especially the remotely piloted aircraft with their full motion video were a key part of enabling the United States to deliver airstrikes in support of Iraqi and Syrian partners without having ground forces on the front lines.
I think that that's really one of the key parts of this operation. Aaron, you mentioned that in some ways this was a big case study for the by, with, and through approach. And here, what you really have is, a decision by, President Obama, then President Obama, and other senior leaders that they were going to leverage air power to reduce some of the risks to U.S. forces and to, in some ways, ensure that the United States was able to fulfill some of its broader obligations and interests, mainly looking for stability in the Middle East, if not worldwide, while not getting sort of embroiled into a ground fight or a super long counterinsurgency operation. And so I think, your point about this being a big case study is 100% true. And I think in some ways, what we're seeing is a maturation of how air power can be applied, in part because of some of the technological advances since, the, very sort of pro air power crowd really took off, post First Gulf War. So, what we're really seeing is just an evolution in how air power is being used. And, one of the reasons we have some lessons learned in the report for future great power conflict is because, we've learned from how air power was applied. We've learned how it's sort of maturated and evolved. And then you can kind of take some of those lessons that we've identified from OIR and think about ways in which, they could benefit us to sort of learn from these lessons if we are going to find ourselves in a future conflict with, say, China or Russia.
One of the things that I think is really worth teasing out here, because you both hinted at it, was, I'm going to simplify it, the role of, RPAs or drones as the sort of critical enabler to use, to have less people on the ground, but still be able to aid with targeting in ways that were, at least trying to be cautious, I think is the right word, so as to try and limit the amount of civilian casualties that went into this. And there's two questions I want to tease out of that. Like, one is that you do see sort of a counter to this, which is that the U.S. was too timid and that air power wasn't fully unleashed perhaps until later in the war, and that you could have sped up the physical destruction of the caliphate, particularly in Syria, if you would have allowed the U.S. Air Force to sort of do the U.S. Air Force sort of big bomb stuff. I don't, I'm really being simplistic, but also which is the connectivity that enabled you to do this. So being able to transmit full motion video around the world so that your JTACs or your air controllers on the ground didn't necessarily have to be in country. Can you talk a little bit about how those two things came into play in this conflict?
So you're absolutely right that the RPAs were important, and it was a permissive environment in that communications weren't contested. The airspace over Iraq was entirely permissive, and even in Syria there was tacit agreement, and things only became more contested over time after the Russians had intervened and the Iranians were in the air there as well. The RPAs were really important, but it was sort of ISR writ large. I think it's just because the full motion video has become something that American military personnel are accustomed to, and having that perfect real-time connectivity, they could use that, whereas they were eyes in the sky, but they provided them with a similar perspective that they could have if they were on the battlefield. So the RPAs were employed in a number of different ways. They were what we call a green force tracker. They helped the Americans and the coalition to understand where the Iraqi and Syrian forces specifically were, so that there weren't friendly fire incidents. They were also used, obviously, for targeting, for finding targets, and sometimes delivering actual munitions directly, though I think their role in that was probably less than maybe what some people might suspect. Speaking to the second part about whether the operation could have been accelerated if air power had been employed in a more forceful fashion early, we came down thinking that that's not actually true. And a lot of this has to do with the specific context, and in particular, the enemy that the United States was facing. Since ISIT is a hybrid adversary, you don't have a set list of targets. It didn't have as much fixed infrastructure and sort of targeting lists and intelligence that the U.S. had built up over time, because it emerged rather so quickly, and really the 2014 in that summer with its big offensive. So that information had to be compiled and built up. And it also was a really adaptive adversary that quickly learned. They stopped massing forces after Kobani, flying the flags, making it easy to find them on the ground. And that is a much more difficult problem to discriminate, whether it really is an ISIS target. At Kobani, they tried to mass and thought that they could overrun the Syrians there, and they failed. And Airpower was used very forcefully and very effective at blunting them and stopping their offensive. But after that, they didn't try that same tact again.
Right. No, that's a great point.
Oh, yeah. I was just
following
going...
along and saying that's exactly right.
I was just going to sort of pile on and just note, in some ways, there's almost a counterfactual argument that, we've been making. But a lot of it had to do with sort of one decision and then sort of one fact. The decision of the approach, again, for OIR to be partner-led, for it to be a partner-led operation that put Iraqi and Syrian partners in the lead, really meant that there needed to be time for those partners to build up capabilities and to, be able to retake territory, not just hold territory, but also retake it because of the identification of territory as the Islamic State's center of gravity. But the second thing that really played in, Stacie had mentioned, and, just was a fact, was, there were just parts of the intelligence process that had atrophied, and it needed to be reinvigorated. For so long, the U.S. Air Force and the intelligence community were used to kind of having these pre-baked targets at the start of a conflict. And they didn't have that with ISIS. So they had to entirely rebuild it from scratch. And that takes time. And, also, again, when you're taking into a lot of considerations that were meant to limit civilian harm, so various elements of, target engagement authority or ways in which the law of armed conflict was applied. In order for anything to go on that target list, there needed to be a certain, proof that it was a viable target. And that also took a lot of time. So when you put those two things together, it really does explain why perhaps, sort of the full might of Airpower wasn't applied straight out the gate in the way in which a lot of our Airpower advocates had really been pushing for. And in some ways, in the manner that we so often think of, being part of an air intervention.
But I also think it's worth clarifying and sort of distilling this down a little bit and tell me, if you want to correct me on this or expand upon this, is that while the full motion video, the connectivity was essential to this, it also, in my opinion, sometimes gives off the false impression of sort of perfect battle space awareness. And just drilling down on the point about how difficult it was to tell, again, particularly in Syria, but also in Iraq too, basically who was who without so many people on the front lines because of the lack of uniforms or the sort of lack of clear and distilled front lines from which to operate from. Obviously, that got better, like as the war went on, but that was, as I understand it, a challenge at the outset.
I mean, I think finding targets was difficult all along, and the problem evolved over the course of the operation. Very, very few things were static. When you got into the big urban battles in Mosul and Raqqa, it's just harder to see what's going on when you have so many buildings and structures that provide cover and camouflage for whoever's there. You can't see through those and tell whether that's an ISIS fighter or not. So you need the broader intelligence and ability to, really verify who's good versus who's on the right side and who's on an adversary there. I'm not sure there are broad generalizations about it getting easier or harder. I think it changed throughout in different ways across the course of the operation. What do you think, Becca?
I also think that there's sort of throughout the course of OIR, you had different parts of technology being used in different ways. Having the full motion video was really helpful to sort of offset the fact that the United States didn't have, JTACs on the ground. And it was a way to sort of make up for some of that. But it had its limitations, as Stacie mentioned. I think we have this great quote from, a senior Air Force leader who, noted, when you're looking at places like Mosul and Raqqa, like our ISR just doesn't go inside buildings. So you don't know who's in a building, and you don't know if it's going to be an ISIS fighter, or you don't know if it's going to be, an Iraqi civilian or a Syrian civilian hiding. So there was this idea that you could get close to perfect information with the FMV, but at the same time, it was imperfect. You also had, particularly for the air to ground fight, you had the introduction of these tablets, almost these iPad-like things that were given to some of the more qualified partners to help call in airstrikes. And they came sort of preloaded with a certain program that allowed them to sort of input GPS coordinates and, sort of explain the case as to why they believe that this would be an airstrike. And that's helpful because in some ways that's essentially building up a JTAC-like capacity within your partners. But it wasn't always something that, the United States and some of the other coalition partners felt comfortable with, executing strikes on. And so oftentimes you had to have, almost these, I don't want to call them a redundant process, but you had to have sort of these two-pronged efforts where you would have, for example, maybe your Iraqi partner calling in airstrikes on a tablet, but then needing to leverage, RPAs or other ISR assets to, ascertain whether those coordinates were correct or whether the situation was exactly as described. So I think it's important to note that there were some of these like technological advances that we didn't have, 10 years ago even, that really sort of changed the playing field, but they also changed over the course of Operation Inherent Resolve. And they both, made targeting better, but at the same time also made it a little bit more complicated.
And if I could just add really quickly, perfect intelligence was, I think, a mischaracterization by far, just because even when you have RPAs, it's a soda straw effect. They don't have a huge wide angle. So you're getting a more tactical view of a situation, which helped a lot when they were trying to integrate with a particular ground unit. But having that broader situational awareness that you want to have would need to be provided by other types of systems that had different sensors on them. And, you'd have to toggle between these different forms of information to get a better picture. The other thing is just to remember how big these countries are, and that there's a lot of area you're trying to survey and keep an eye on and looking for very, very small things, and that's challenging.
The other thing is that perhaps we'll dive into this a little bit is, while I would say that the Air Force in particular has been heavily used since, basically since September 11th, 2001, one thing that the OIR war revealed is basically having to relearn some things, because of the history of pilots operating in certain environments in Iraq and Afghanistan. I guess Iraq pre-2011, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the misconceptions that people have is that OIR was very similar to the counterinsurgency wars in Afghanistan and then in Iraq before 2011. And when you look at the data that we compiled, you realize how dissimilar they actually were. Especially in Afghanistan, which was, operations are still going on today, but was going on concurrently with OIR. There were a lot of airplanes flying overhead doing what they call on-call strikes, circles in the sky waiting, but very few of them were actually dropping bombs at that point. I think that they were up there more for intelligence and assurance than necessarily actually providing a lot of support to ground forces. And in OIR during, once the Iraqi offensive began, you had a lot of operations that were going on, and Airpower was providing essential firepower at that point on a scale that is just way outstripped what you saw in the counterinsurgency campaigns.
Yeah, so there were a lot of skills that, definitely, I think the Air Force really had to sort of relearn or at least refamiliarize themselves with. So, one that we've already talked about is trying to sort of reinvigorate the intelligence process and the way to, really sort of input that into the broader targeting cycle. But one of the reasons why it was such a struggle is just, again, folks weren't used to building some of these, targets from scratch. And, it also created a need to sort of reinvigorate the way in which the Air Force and DoD more broadly interacts with the rest of the interagency. You also saw that in some ways until the Russians intervened in Syria, there really hadn't been a huge focus on the need for, U.S. Air Force pilots to really be trained up on the defensive counter-air fight. And they found themselves needing to do DCA on almost a daily basis. And, Aaron, I know you know a lot about this, so I won't get ahead of you on it because I'm sure you could school us on it. But, DCA was a huge thing where skills had to be relearned. And in some ways, empowering pilots to be willing to do DCA was a huge part of what had to happen within, with some of the senior commanders. I'll also just say that, one other thing that continually came up as an issue and in some ways is something that needed to be relearned and I think still needs to be a little bit worked on, but isn't necessarily sort of in the clear toolkit of skills that, Air Force, professionals need to know, is battle space management was a huge issue. And so that's not just because there were complexities, because there were so many partners involved and because of, the broader coalition, but even just within the U.S. Joint Force and, more specifically, U.S. Army, Marines on the ground, and then, Air Force equities. That's definitely something that, we within the Joint Force are going to have to tackle, particularly as we look to future wars against near peer competitors as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good segue into sort of one of the main unforeseen challenges, is that as the air war continued, and, Stacie, you mentioned this at the beginning, it stopped just being the coalition and the Syrian Air Force. It became, the Iranians had air assets there, and I think the more troubling ones were the Russians. And the complexities and challenges of operating in a confined space with, a non-friendly, but basically a co-inhabitant of the Syrian airspace, but was not declared hostile, So just all these challenges it took when that airspace got really congested.
Yeah, my favorite quote with respect to this is General Brown, who's now Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who characterized the airspace over Syria or U.S. operations there as flying permissively in a non-permissive environment. And the fact that the Syrian regime had sort of tacitly accepted the coalition's intervention against ISIS as long as they didn't interfere with its own efforts to regain territory. And that over time, as the regime turned things around with the support of the Russians and the Iranians, it was operating in increasingly close proximity to American forces. And you had some of those air-to-air encounters, but a lot of them were also driven by close encounters on the ground and American Airpower needing to provide support to the SOF and the Syrian partners that were on the ground at places like Antanif and stuff.
Yeah, so there's I'm really biased here, but I actually think that some of the best quotes that we were able to feature from some senior Air Force leaders, as well as some pilots and other folks, really come in the section of the report when we talk about some of the defensive counter-air fight and the ways in which, U.S. pilots had to deal with really aggressive Russian maneuvers, as well as, some of the complications of having, the Russians in the sky, the Syrians in the sky, as well as the Iranians. And, here, I think one of the most interesting things is that there was a decision on the part of senior leaders to empower pilots to be able to sort of expand their rules of engagement as needed, in order to protect, forces on the ground, which, at various times included U.S. Special Operations Forces. And, again, if we're pulling out favorite quotes, I'll pull out my favorite one, which was from Cobra Hurricane, who said that, he had to go and look at his airmen eyeball to eyeball and reiterate to them that he believed that they could make the right choice. And if they needed to shoot down, a Syrian aircraft that was threatening forces on the ground, that were penetrating the Al-Tanf exclusion zone, that he very much trusted them too. And shortly after, you have the really, pretty well-known case of, U.S. Navy pilots actually having a shoot-down incident with a Syrian Su-22 fighter.
One of the other challenges that I heard about in my own interviews, and perhaps we'll pivot to the end here, just one more cycle through, is that, is just, the complexities of working through a partner force. And being able to deliver munitions from air to ground, with non-Americans in most cases, on the ground doing the target selection. I mean, is that something that you two came across in your research as well?
Definitely. I mean, just think about it. The language barriers, the different tactics, techniques, and procedures that they're used to. In Iraq, in both countries, you had different forces. You had the Kurds in Iraq, or the Iraqi army, or the CTS. And in Syria, it was even more of a cobbled together group of different organizations fighting together. So understanding how and being able to operate together in a way that would work when you're doing it and learning on the fly in the course of a war has to be incredibly difficult. There have to be trust issues on both sides. Are they going to trust the U.S. Airpower will be there to support them? Are we trusting the intelligence that they provide in terms of we're sure that it meets our standards for engagement? I think it was incredibly difficult and pretty amazing the way that we succeeded at working with them, especially given the array of different groups that were there.
Yeah, it was definitely a kaleidoscope of different groups and various processes that had to be, frankly, built from the ground up. I also think that there are just, some additional complexities, for example, trying to identify, perhaps maybe for one of your partners, acceptable collateral damage looks really different from, U.S. standards, as well as some of the other coalition partners. Maybe perhaps the Australians also had a different view as to what acceptable collateral damage might be. So, trying to work through some of those issues definitely is added complexity and made it even more difficult with what was already a pretty, sizable challenge at hand. There's also other reasons and other ways in which sometimes, partners dictated how and when air power was used. So for example, the U.S. ended up withholding some air power in a few cases. I think the Battle of Tikrit was actually a pretty notable one, in part because the Iraqi partner forces that were moving forward were part of the PMF, which had links to Iran, which for the United States was, just a little bit of a bridge too far and not something, that some of our leaders were comfortable with, and in part because there's a whole lot of complexity there. So, it just adds to some additional ways in which this was a challenge, and really, in some ways, kind of dictated how air power was used, and also sometimes when it wasn't used.
Yeah, and one thing is perhaps how air power became like a motivating factor for the partner forces, i.e. they wouldn't move unless there was the presence of coalition jets or U.S. jets, or striking road crossings, to proactively prevent against vehicle-borne IEDs or something along those lines. So like really expensive bombs being dropped on really inexpensive roads just to get people to move up in the fight. I mean, that's something else I stumbled across. I'm sure you both did as well.
Yeah, we did. And we heard them described as morale strikes,
Yeah.
which I think is a really good way to describe them.
Well, I guess the final question here, we've been going at it for about 30 minutes, and it is a Friday, and we'll wrap up here, is just the broad overview. Like this is considered a model, in my opinion, the by, with, and through for a way to do sort of, let's call it lean intervention, lean military operations. If this were to come off the shelf again, how do you think it would go?
Well, I think it depends where it would come off the shelf and be applied to. I think this might be a model that can be applied against, another non-state like adversary in the Middle East. But the thing is, I think it's going to be really difficult for us to see another adversary that was like the Islamic State, that had both these, terrorist organization attributes, but at the same time has these state-like attributes and holds territory and taxes citizens. So that's definitely something that we need to think about. But at the same time, by, with, and through is very much going to be, if you read the tea leaves, if you listen to folks who are now in the new Biden administration, there's definitely a preference for by, with, and through for future interventions, whether those are humanitarian interventions or, prompted by other reasons. I think that a by, with, and through approach would be, once again, really hard to apply in, a conflict with a near peer competitor like Russia or China. And I think that if this ends up being the approach that the United States wants to use around the globe, there's definitely going to be some pretty steep learning curves, and there's going to be some challenges. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this is how warfare evolves. This is how, different tactics and operational concepts and broader strategies actually evolve. And, we can dream them up, in our think tanks that we are all respectively a part of. But, it's actually sort of applying them and road testing them in a real way that often allows for some of the variation in how some of these techniques are used. So, I do think that there would be a challenge in sort of doing a by, with, and through approach in, against China. But, there are ways in which different forces can adapt to try and make it work. Because ultimately, the by, with, and through approach is about trying to reduce some of the risk to U.S. forces and to, keep the United States a little bit away from the front lines.
Yeah, I would just add that I would caution against overgeneralizing that there's a template for war that we're going to be applying to multiple different adversaries or different places. There should be a retrospective looking back at this and acknowledging what happened and taking stock of the innovations that occurred in the course of the operation and what was learned. But every situation, I think you're going to end up needing different operational concepts because so many of the context is just very different, and that's something that is going to dictate ultimately what your strategy should be and what type of operations you'll be able to engage in successfully.
Becca and Stacie, this has been great. It's been a lot of fun. I would encourage everybody to go check out the full report itself, the full book, I should say, The Air War Against the Islamic State. You can find it on the RAND Corporation's website. So, Becca and Stacie, have a good rest of your Friday, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Chain Reaction. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes and Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the handle @FPRI. Chain Reaction is a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.